Hello, everybody. International Master David Proust here to go over Game 11 of the Anand Carlsen World Championship match from today. This is quite an interesting game, and it's yet another Berlin defense, which obviously has cropped up a couple times already this match and been something that we've discussed for a while as to whether or not it's a good opening choice for Anand, and also whether or not I have any idea what's going on in this opening. So I've said that the Berlin is one of the openings that I understand the least well in all of chess. So I'm not any kind of expert on it, and it's tough for me to do the commentary on those games. But for today's game, I studied a wee little bit, and I think I figured out one or two things. They'll be pretty basic, so if you're, a grandmaster who plays the Berlin defense, don't bother watching my video. Thank you. For everyone else, maybe there will be something at your level of understanding of the Berlin that could be of interest here in a pretty interesting game, I have to say. So let's have a good look at this opening. See where we got it here. Perfect. Okay, and let's get to the main position here. I think that Magnus played a great game with d3 early on in the tournament, and I was surprised that he never went back to it. I think that if the match had been tied, he might have gone back to this kind of d3 line and tried to maneuver Anand in a longer game with more equal chances for both sides to outmaneuver the other. But I think because he was ahead a point when Anand played his second, third, and fourth Berlins of the match, because he was ahead a point, he seemed to be willing to go into the end game and accept a higher chance of a draw. So the last three games, despite a very good game with d3, he went for the main line with castle and then d4, letting black take on e4, which tends nowadays to lead to this series of exchanges. And this is sort of the current modern main line of the Berlin defense, also called the Berlin wall, because of Kramnik's ability to make a bunch of draws in a row against Kasparov using this opening. It was kind of like, a wall that Kasparov couldn't get through, or that was the idea. So he goes for the main line for the third time, and the first two times he did not achieve anything as white in those games, and they were pretty easy draws for Anand. Today as well, I think Anand got equality out of the opening, but let's get there in a little bit. I think Anand switched up his line from the previous game, where I think he'd played king to e8 variation, and here he just switches up to another variation. The Berlin defense is a little bit confusing because there's this for a million reasons, but one of the things that's confusing about the Berlin defense is that there's a wide range of possible variations for black with king c8, king e8, bishop d7, h6, all these kind of different moves. And similarly for white, they could play rook d1, they could play bishop b2, they could play bishop f4, they can play knight e2, knight f4. There's so many different lines that sometimes there's this stretch between moves like 9 and 13 or 14 where the two sides seem to almost be playing kind of like solitaire chess for a few moves, kind of like doing a few moves in peace, setting up what they want without any sort of tactics back and forth. And then all of a sudden, things start to get critical, and you realize that those setup moves did matter, but it was not very easy to tell how the moves were interacting with each other at first. So it's a big choice to develop the bishop here versus over here. Either way, it's blocked by the pawn on e5. So I think either way, you'd kind of like to be able to get this guy out of the way. That's sort of like the major problem with the Berlin endgame for white, is that this pawn is far advanced on a dark square, blocking your remaining bishop, and black has very, very good chances of setting up blockades on these two light squares, which keeps you from unifying this pawn with this pawn and sort of getting any mobility. So if this pawn can't move at all and has no mobility, then it basically blocks this bishop perpetually. And, that blockade restricts white's bishop and, keeps his pawns from threatening black or from kicking black's pieces out of the squares they want. So the bishop here will overprotect e5 and possibly aim at the king side at some point. The bishop here will overprotect e5 and aim at the c7 pawn. If black's king had come to e8, it might be stronger to have the bishop on this diagonal, as in game 9 of the match. I think game 9 was the second Berlin defense of the match. No, that would be wrong. That would definitely be wrong. Let me think again. Because this is game 11. Game 9 was the third, so game 7. Yeah. Sorry, 6 and 7 were the back-to-back whites for Carlsen. So in game 7, he had his bishop on this diagonal, attacking the c7 pawn. And here he goes and puts it over on b2. The c7 pawn defended. And black gains a little bit of space with this c5 move. And I wonder sometimes what the point of random moves that happen in the Berlin are. I understand the point of b6 and king b7 is to connect the rooks. And I was wondering about the point of c5, and I think one of the points of c5 is to avoid knight to d4 by white, because often they want to remaneuver this knight to some square, or white's going to threaten g4 at some point, so the knight has to be willing to maneuver again. So if the knight moves, then knight d4 becomes a possible move for white. So c5 first to forestall that. I think that's one of the points of it, is taking away that square from white's knight. So these moves get played. The downside of this, of course, is that white can plop a knight on d5 for free. And it's a pretty strong square for the knight. And you don't really want to play c6 as black, because then you're starting to make just too many pawn moves on the queen side. And white will get the d6 square possibly. And yeah, I mean, there's a limit to how much you want to move these pawns at the moment, or how quickly. So develop. Yeah. If I ever played this opening as white, I would really start looking into ways to play e6 quickly and sort of randomly and by surprise. But I don't know if I'd be able to, because as you see, black is establishing a quick blockade of this square. And now there's no knight d4 to trade one of these pieces. Yeah, so let's talk about what white should be doing here, maybe, because the first time I played through this, it seemed like white was kind of planless for the next 9 to 10 moves. And actually, I looked up some comments online and saw that Carlsen in the press conference had also been of the opinion that he kind of drifted around for a few moves and didn't really accomplish anything precise or do anything terribly impressive as white in this next phase of the game, in terms of developing a plan, putting pressure on black, gaining some kind of an advantage. So yeah, so let's talk about what's going on in this position at a very, very basic level. So we've already talked about how this pawn is not good. Let's talk about the different pieces and which ones are stronger or weaker, or which ones you might like to trade. In my opinion, white's worst piece at the moment is the dark squared bishop. Okay, and I think one of the reasons that white never gets anything going this game is that this bishop remains a bad piece for the next 12 moves or so. So this is a piece which I think is like not a good piece for white. And if white wants to try to sort of make inroads or convert this position against black, one option would be to deal with this pawn being blockaded. Not happening. Next, we could consider various trades. Well, white can maneuver around the knights and offer trades for black's pieces. And a lot of trades come up in this game. For one thing, because white, just sort of plops the knight on d5. So for many moves, black has the option to trade it since it's sitting here. And white is going to have the option to trade black's knight or bishop on e7 if those pieces ever pass through there, which, spoiler alert, that's one of the main squares black has for maneuvering here. So they're both going through there. So white's going to have all these options to trade pieces. And so the question arises, which piece trades would white like to do to sort of maximize their chances of winning this kind of an endgame? Black has the bishop pair, so sometimes you would like to trade off your opponent's bishop pair, right, when you don't have the bishop pair, in order to eliminate that kind of advantage that the opponent has. Well, which pieces do you think are black's best pieces in this position? Which ones would you trade your knights for? I've already told you this is our worst piece, so you're probably guessing that I would gladly trade it for any of black's minor pieces. If that's what you're guessing, you're correct. So let's just put that behind us. This piece, I'm really not happy about him after playing through this game and thinking about it for a while. And I'm thinking I would be happy to trade him for any of those black pieces. What about the knights? Who's worthy of trading our knights for them? Do we want to trade our knight for this bishop, or for this knight? What do we think? And the answer is that the trades are a little bit dependent. But let's start off by like sort of well ordering black's minor pieces. Which is his best minor piece, his next best minor piece, etc. Okay. All right. Here's my order, which could be wrong, but I think black's best piece is the light squared bishop because I see the most like open light square diagonals on the board, and there's no piece to oppose him, and he's on the diagonal that covers the two key squares for blockading white's kingside pawn majority, keeping it from becoming a big factor. So to me, the champion of the 6 minor pieces on the board right now is this light squared bishop. And you'll notice that, when Carlsen plays knight d5, Anand does not rush to play bishop takes d5 here, right? Not bishop d5. Which he could do without any concession at this point, right? Just trade it off. The only concession being that you're trading off the best minor piece of your own. So best piece, I would say this guy. Second best piece for me by a small margin over the dark squared bishop is the knight. The knight has a little bit more maneuvering ability than the bishop right now, and there aren't really many open dark squared diagonals. So if I'm trying to think of like which kind of endgames black could lose, I'm thinking if white could trade his knights for these two pieces, then white would have chances to win a same color bishop endgame with the kingside majority, right? If you imagine these 4 pieces off the board, does this pawn majority on the kingside now look blockaded? Much less blockaded looking, right? And then same color bishops also in general help for winning endgames. So that's another way you could conceive of it. Imagine trading these 4 pieces. Now you've got the opposite colored bishops and the pawn on e5. Does that look like an endgame with any real winning chances for white? I would say immediately it strikes me as no winning chances for white. Black's bishop is better than yours, which to me more than compensates for having a majority on the king side in that position. So I wouldn't be surprised if black were slightly better even in that situation. But again, very highly likely to be a draw, right? When you've got opposite colored bishops and an endgame without too big an advantage for either side and a blockade going on. So if we're looking for trades, one of the most likely trades white would want to do would be to trade one of these knights for this bishop. But it's going to be dependent on whether or not black's taking back with a pawn, whether it's changing the pawn structure, whether you want that change or not. The pawn coming into e6 can often help black to really keep a perfect blockade, even though it's a pawn structure weakening. If white can never open the position, the fact that black's pawn structure is a little bit weaker doesn't matter as long as they have a perfect blockade. Okay, and with this pawn really far advanced and this pawn on a light square that white has few pieces that could attack, and controlling penetration points, and then black putting a rook on the f-file to further restrain the f-pawn. It's very hard for white to get anything rolling in the positions where the knight takes on e6, I think. So very often, even though this is black's best minor piece, you will see someone play something like knight d5, king to b7, knight to f4, and you won't see this bishop run away, right? You'll simply see someone play a move like bishop e7 and let you take it. And they'll, often hold positions like this. Of course, not here because I played a ridiculous move for black, and here I think white can play some version of rook d7 and g4 to get a big advantage going. But in general, you would like to trade these pieces as white, but sometimes if black can take back fe, it's still okay for them. Now, in terms of like a knight trade, I think a knight trade would tend to be okay for white, but it's close to equal, your knight's and black's knight, so it doesn't represent a huge accomplishment, and it very, very much depends on the specifics of the position. Like sometimes white can get a nice space advantage. Like in this game, you see Carlsen setting up with his pawn on c4 and pawn on e5. He's supporting d5, so he's playing to partly have this like nice space advantage. And then sometimes you might not want to trade knights if you're trying to cramp the opponent as part of your strategy. Okay, so so black plays g5 in this case. This is gaining space for black, further controlling f4 to maybe prevent this pawn from coming up. And it's preventing the knight f4 idea with the threat of knight e6. And that's probably partly because if black has to play king b7 here to coordinate the rooks, they've got issues with defending the d7 square here because they're not in time to play bishop e7 and rook d8. Right? Their development is just like a tempo too slow to really justify allowing this knight f4, knight e6 kind of thing. So after knight d5, we see black playing g5, perhaps partly to prevent knight f4 here. Now, it gives up a huge juicy outpost for white on f6, and this is not something that we can miss or overlook about this move. Normally, you would think black's weaker on the king side, since white has the pawn majority here. So you'd want to be really careful as black about making weaknesses on that side of the board or making any pawn advances. So this move, gives white a lever to perhaps open up the king side at some point, and it gives white an outpost with which to try and control more squares on that side of the board and make black's position more miserable. So what's the justification for this move? It's a little bit tricky. I mean, on the one hand, as we're going to see concretely in this game, Carlsen's not able to do very much with this square. Okay, fine, that's one judgment. But I mean, long term, he would eventually have been able to do something with this square. So it's not like just because it doesn't come up quickly, it's not a weakness. It is a weakness. That is clear and certain. Does it give black some kind of counterplay like this? I don't really believe so. I don't believe black has a very active attacking plan on the king side at this point. His pieces look nice with the blockade here, but he doesn't have an attack, and he doesn't have white's overall coordination. If you look at those three pieces, white has a dud bishop that can't help on the king side, but black's coordination does not look like king side attack. So as far as I can tell, this move is largely aimed just at preventing the move knight to f4 for the moment. Okay. So we get to this position. And again, let's ask the question that we were asking a move before, which was, what are white's plans here? Well, we talked about the trades. White might like to trade one or both of these pieces for his knights. Yeah, wouldn't be bad for white, especially black's just put another pawn on a dark square. So the same color bishop endgame is definitely looking pretty palatable for white. So if you could trade this knight for one of these two pieces, that would probably be good for you. This knight has become a little bit of a bad piece after this move and this move. You see that black is covering that square, and he's also covering that square with the h6 move, and this pawn blockades the knight. So this piece is getting to be in pretty bad relation to the other to the black pawns and to the whole position in general. So if we could just trade this knight for one of these pieces, that might be a great plan. right now, there's not really much of an obvious avenue for doing that, right? I mean, where do we want to go with this knight? How do we get there in time? What does it do once it gets there? It's actually quite tricky to make use of this piece. So at this point, I would say, okay, this piece is kind of a bad piece. I wish I could trade it. But I'm not really seeing how, so that can't be my main plan. So what could white's main plan in this position be? Well, after looking at it for a while and seeing how Magnus didn't really achieve much, I think white's main plan in this position is to play either f4 or h4 in order to make progress on the king side, trade a pawn or two, create some kind of opportunities on that side of the board. Black's king looks like it's clearly going to spend the game on the queen side, which is one less defender if fighting breaks out on the king side. And then again, white has their pawn majority on the king side. So I think the main plan for white at this point should be to play either f4 or h4. That definitely makes sense to me. Now, I saw in an analysis that Dayan did, that Grandmaster Dayan Boykov did online, that he mentioned that there was a game once which went knight to h2. This is kind of like the opposite of Carlsen's approach to the position. This is like super purposeful, hyper rushing, like the main plan for white. And what did black play? I know white just went, crazy for f4 basically is the point. Maybe black even just played the move king to b7. I don't know for sure. They played some move and white went straight for f4. I might be getting this slightly wrong. But no matter. Let's just run with it for the moment. The point is that white actually got a bad position by playing f4 too quickly because black was able to counterattack. And I think a very strong move for black here that black didn't play is c4. Just bringing the bishop to c5 with knight g3 checkmate to follow. That's the threat. Bishop c5 and then king to either square, knight g3 checkmate. A very strong move that black didn't play. Another strong move which black did play is, since white's knight has come out of the center, black plops his knight into the center, threatening this piece. If white takes to defend the knight, then bishop c5 wins everything. So suddenly this knight's under attack, which is the knight defending this pawn. This knight's come into position where you can't really deal with it and is threatening to play knight c2. And this proved to be not that good for white. So apparently, if that game and analysis is to be trusted, and it made sense to me, you can't just run straight at your opponent with f4 immediately. You do have to, have sufficient control and sufficient preparation that, if you move this knight to a bad square and then try to open the position, f4 is not always going to be good for you. Same with g4 isn't always going to be good for you. If I play h4, there may be some situation where black just plays g4. I retreat my knight here. They play knight h4, defending the pawn like this. And basically, I trapped my own knight on h2 and sacked a pawn, and basically should be asking myself, why? Okay? So there's moves you want to play. That doesn't mean you just play them right away. You do have to sort of force them through or set them up or, make them actually good. Put in the work. But it's good to know what your goal is. So then I started thinking about, what could white do with this knight to set up, a better version of what happened in the game. And it's actually quite hard to come up with a quick maneuver to get this knight into good position to allow us to, play like a useful f4. But as far as I can tell, that's sort of like the only real way to go. So let's advance a little bit with how the game actually went, which is c4. To me, this is still and we'll just keep in mind, right? We're going to just advance forward, and we're going to keep in mind that this is kind of like what white actually needs to look for doing. Meanwhile, what black is doing is still just finishing coordinating their pieces, finding squares for them. This bishop could possibly sit here or here. Anyway, c4. I like this move. This move protects the knight, which frees up the rook a little bit, right? And for example, if you wanted to play knight d2 at some point, because this knight doesn't have a lot of squares, c4 will keep you from hanging your knight on d5 when you play knight d2. It gains some more space. It strengthens the d5 square, gives black less chances to capture it. If black plays a move like knight e7, they won't be threatening knight d5. You won't have to respond to it immediately. So, you know, if you had some combination, if you wanted to do something like g4, you know, you retreat, and then I play h4, cracking the king side. And I know this move is like bad for a million reasons. But the point is, it would be useful to have your knight defended if you wanted some idea like this to work, so that your opponent can't just capture the knight. So c4, fine move. He just continues to coordinate. And now here you see kind of like a cautious move from Magnus, king to h2. So what the king is doing is it's moving up to provide more support for these pawns, right? He wants to play some version of g4, knight back, king g3, h4, and have his king kind of defend these pawns, because they can come under fire from black's light squared bishop. Essentially, your opponent has this light square blockade, and they have the only light squared bishop. You're weak on light squares. If you want to try and reconquer some of the squares on that diagonal, you have to understand that it's going to be kind of an uphill fight. There's a lot of ways to play, you know, g4, knight here. Now I move my knight to play f4, let's say. So I go knight h2. There's going to be a lot of situations where your opponent can kind of play h5 and generate threats against your light squares. So you need to be prepared for that and have those squares adequately defended, because the light squares are not going to tend to just fall into white's lap. So that's kind of like the idea behind king h2, is to be able to come up and defend those squares. It works out to be maybe a little bit slow. So this is, you know, one position where we could wonder whether white would be better off just starting to twirl the knight, right? So let's just try another variation, a variation with a knight twirl. So I go knight d2, and I'm coming to e4. Say I play knight e7 for black, maybe. Just a move. Come here with this knight. Keep maneuvering. All right, so now we can start getting a little bit more concrete over the fight over f4, right? I can't play f4 yet. Black has it covered twice, plus in some cases they could trade their light squared bishop and then capture the pawn. So I'm going to need this square to be better covered. On the other hand, black's preparing to play bishop g7 and threaten my e5 pawn. So like if I play a rook to e1, bishop g7, and then I have to scramble to try and defend this pawn, that's going to be unfortunate. Okay, so what do I want to do to try and get f4 through? I can't play g3 because of this pawn. I've improved my knight quite a bit compared to f3, but it's still not like attacking anything or in range of trading for these pieces. So what does white do? Well, let's try maybe the maneuver that that Carlsen was sort of eventually going for in the game, and bring the knight to f6. So my idea now is to put this knight on h5. From h5, I'm controlling f4, and I'm trying to play f4 myself here. Okay, so now, you know, I'm also keeping the pressure off of the square, by the way, because if black had played bishop g7, I was going to go knight h5, attacking that piece. So then if it retreats, there's less pressure on e5. But I suppose, you know, we could also reckon with black playing rook here to defend this. Okay, But then we have to start looking for tactics if it might be time to get f4 through. Okay, so for example, f4. Let's just try it. So if black just takes and I take with either knight, I'm not sure which would be better here. I've made my main pawn breakthrough. I'm looking at being willing to trade here. Because, you know, I would even have rook to d7 at the moment. Black can't challenge the d file with rook d8 because this bishop is defended by the rook, so the rook is doing two jobs. This looks like a successful improvement of the position for white, right? And his knights have gotten into good position where they're ready to trade for the two pieces we want and leave us with this endgame of these pieces. So far, so good, I would say, for white in that variation. So let's try something else. Let's say black takes over here. Now we really need to calculate. Okay. So I can take with the pawn or I could take with the rook, and they both have their advantages. Taking with the pawn is to try and roll these pawns forward. Taking with the rook is to try to go to d7 as compensation for losing the pawn on f4. So let's try this first. Rook here. Knight f4 to take away white's options of knight g7. Knight f4, pawn takes f4. Could go to d7 right away, but I'm worried about counterplay here. Maybe I should try to clean this pawn up and have the rook defending this pawn for the moment. That looks accurate. Rook f1. Now black has an option of playing a move like rook to d8. But I feel like black's under considerable pressure here. So rook d8, for example, rook f4, takes, and this pressure is annoying. Like super annoying. I guess this would be the only move to still try for black. Rook f7, bishop here. Bishop takes, rook takes, d6. Black. So black's basically going down a pawn in this rook and pawn ending. He's got a decent threat in this c5 pawn, but this is actually kind of annoying, and then white can go after the h pawn. It looks dangerous for black. I'll just put it as dangerous for the moment. Other option would be to go after this, and then rook f4, try to somehow get pressure here, but c6 just allows rook here. King here, rook f7. Yeah, it's not good. And rook here. I mean, one option is this. Trading it all off. Takes, rook here, rook here, rook here. So if black goes rook here, he can't trade rooks. The king and pawn ending would be a loss because this makes a pass pawn pretty fast, and black on the queen side doesn't. So he pretty much has to just keep the white rook from attacking this pawn from the side. So play something like this. And then, you know, g4. This is like a classic example of where white's pawn majority is quite a bit better than black's. And it's a dangerous endgame for black, I would say. And, you know, that was me who chose to trade things off as white. White could also try and put more pressure on black longer with rook f5, defending the pawn, and, you know, continue to turn the screws from here. So, yeah, that looks kind of tough for black to do something like that. So let's go with my bishop e7 line, knight h5, and go from here. So again, white's kind of looking to try and play f4 here, but now there aren't tactics on this diagonal in the same way. So let's say I played rook g8 for black. Kind of defending against f4 with counter threats against these squares as well. So, for example, f4. All right, I don't want to just trade on f4 a bunch of times as black. This is not what I'm searching for. Yeah, just no real strong counter threat here from black, and he's going to be weak on this isolated pawn and possibly head towards the same color bishop endgame. That's not what I was looking for black. I was looking to have enough counterplay to maybe take here again. White could go either way again, and we can always look at pawn takes if rook takes isn't good. But last time we looked at rook takes and it was good, and then we never had to look at pawn takes. Okay, so now I want to go here. Yeah, because otherwise this knight just blocks my file. Takes, takes. We get here. It's basically the same kind of thing as before, right? Did I even change anything? I guess the bishop's here instead of here. So I could defend the pawn. And I could also play rook e1 and then rook e8, and nothing immediate pops up. All right, so rook f1, bishop g5. You know, like what I'm looking for, I'm kind of scrambling as black, but what I'm looking for to try and save this game is a trick like this one, right? Rook f3, bishop takes c1. Bishop takes g5, pawn takes g2. This is the kind of thing I'm trying to save my game with as black here. But I don't know if it's enough to save my game. I mean, I'm still under some pressure as black here. White's trying to use this pawn as a serious threat. Well, frankly, it still just looks bad for black. Yeah. Yeah, it's still a struggle. So, so here Magnus played king h2, and I wonder if maybe just maneuvering the knight right away to a better square, since it's our worst piece and our problem piece, maneuvering it to a better square right away, which is something like this, and then looking for a chance to try and orchestrate f4. I wonder if that more straightforward plan might not be worth a try for white. Now, of course, I haven't, in this variation, one thing I haven't done is I haven't tried the counterplay that Anand actually did in the game. But it was really unusual, and I don't know for sure if it would work at any point in the variations I was just trying. But that's, I don't know. To me, that's a very interesting approach for white. Just looking for a chance to play f4. And one nice thing about it is, even if I'm not able to play f4, at least I spent my time taking my worst placed piece and moving it somewhere else. But I guess it's an important question how quickly black could get some kind of counterplay on the queen side as well versus this line, because he certainly didn't sit still. But basically, compared to the game, I'm saving 2 moves or even 3 moves in terms of Magnus's preparation for action. So king h2 is what he plays. a5, a4. Yeah, pretty much obligatory, because a4 starts to soften up our queenside pawn structure and activates the opponent's rook on a file that actually has more penetration points at the moment than the d file, which is all covered by black. But there's a2 for white to worry about, so white doesn't want to open the a file. It's pretty much obligatory to play a4. Knight e7, and now he plays g4. And g4 both nails down black's pawn on a dark square and regains control of light squares for white. So nailing this down is good if you want to be able to trade it, right? And you don't want it to move. It's also good if you want to aim for an endgame with dark squared bishops left, if you want to trade your knights for these 2 pieces. You want to leave these on the board. You love to nail down a pawn on a dark square. So in general, I mean, it makes sense positionally very much. It also prevents black from at some point playing bishop f5 and suddenly getting in behind your pawns where they'll suddenly seem weak. When you have a pawn structure on the same color as your opponent's bishop, as long as their bishop is in front of those pawns, it can be a very strong tool for limiting their piece and keeping it at bay. But if their piece ever gets behind it, it's just horrifying. So this move makes a lot of sense as like a useful move to have thrown in at some point. I wonder if any of those variations I was just toying around with, if there was ever a point where black would have wanted to go for that kind of a thing. So like knight g6, knight here. All right, what if now I play a5 for black, going for a4, a4 from white, and then play bishop f5, going for bishop c2? Is this an issue? We must ask ourselves. Frankly, I don't feel like immediately concerned by this. I mean, it's one penetration point that I think I can cover. I could even play the move knight e3, right, and just send that piece back. I mean, it takes me off of f4 with this knight. All right, got that under control. Now next I want to play knight h5 and f4. So what's black going to do about it? I mean, this is what he wants to put counterplay on, but he doesn't have a good way to use the bishop because of this knight h5 move. And he can't play any of these moves in advance because the knight is taking away those squares from the rooks. So, I mean, it's not like this weak square is completely irrelevant. Yeah, so I want to go knight h5 and then f4. I mean, I assume black playing g4 at any point is just going to be bad for them. By the way, all you people watching, if you have any questions, please ask me your questions live. I'm happy to try and touch on whatever you think is of interest. But what I'm going to say here is I don't really see how this creates any counterplay that white can't deal with here. I feel pretty secure dealing with that. If black plays a move like rook d8, hoping to inconvenience me with like a pin like this, I'm happy to play bishop c3 at some point and keep this piece defended. Not worried about playing that move. The bishop was not any better on b2 or anything. And I can also play a move like rook to d1 even, possibly. And, you know, black has to worry about their undefended rook as well. So I don't, at the moment, I don't see or feel how that's any kind of real problem for white. And I'm getting ready to complete my knight h5 f4 plan just the same. And I don't really care that your bishop is on f5 at the moment. Okay. So answering that in that way. Let's go back to the king h2 version. So g4 is played. So again, I mean, there's lots of positional factors that make the g4 move look good. On the other hand, it's also spending time and it's not, you know, advancing this f4 plan very quickly. So knight g6, and now the king comes up, defending these squares better, and maybe looking for some kind of opportunity to play h4. And yeah, and you know, the king is stronger and defends these things. But yeah, white's not going to get an f4 this game because somehow this took a little bit too much time, I think. So first of all, Anand plays bishop to e7, preventing h4. And Carlsen passes up the chance to trade off black's less good bishop. Okay, he does not go for this trade because this bishop here in the opposite colored bishop position is just very, very strong. There seems to be no way for white to penetrate or to break the blockade on his kingside pawn majority. But I imagine, like anything, there's probably some complications around h4 and f4 attempts even here. I imagine things could get more complicated here. F3 or rook e4 are the candidate moves. And I don't know which one's better. And now this. What I'm trying to do as black by counterattacking where I'm weaker is I'm trying to create a pawn structure that remains blockaded. The last thing I want to do is give white a chance to roll this pawn to f5 and sort of break the blockade, okay? So if I play a stupid move and you play f4 and then I go for rook g8, and I guess you can't play f5 probably because of knight f5, but if I somehow gave white time to play f5, then the blockade's broken and white has a normal, strong pawn majority. I mean, not normal because it's very unusual for white to get such a great pawn majority in this opening, but that's what I can't give white time for. But I think very simply with rook g8 and h5, I'm pretty much going to force white into this kind of a pawn trade, and then they can never unseat the bishop, they can never unseat the f7 pawn, and consequently these two pawns are not destined to queen. And if you can't threaten to queen one of those pawns, then long-term you're not doing anything to me. So, so white does not go for the trade on e7. All right. Even though it could allow h4. Just not enough there. So he goes for knight to d2. So now he's starting to reposition that knight, which wasn't well placed. And Anand develops his rook. And now he can reposition the bishop here. Once white's knight has retreated, he doesn't need that bishop to stop h4. That was kind of the only thing the bishop was doing on that square. And now he got his rooks connected, so there's a little bit more pressure on d5, right? Like on this move here after rook d8, black's threatening to possibly win a pawn, which might not even be good for him, but he's kind of threatening it. So now white has less time for those kind of maneuvers. Brings the bishop back. All right. And now Magnus plays knight f6. So again, he wants to go for f4, but there's pressure on d5, and this knight's restraining f4, and he's got to bring this piece around all the way to h5 before he'll start to threaten this move again. So he heads that way. And when you look at these games, often it feels like kind of like a slow maneuvering game. But one of the things I realized once I started to get into it was like, wait a minute, this game something was happening. Things were getting really close. And I saw a tweet online from Grandmaster Jan Ludwig Hammer in which he said, like, don't make the mistake of thinking that nothing's going on. Give white 3 extra moves, and he can actually do some serious stuff on the king side. And when I first read that tweet, I didn't understand it. It was just like a clue. It was just like, oh, super GMs are talking above me, and I don't know what it's about. But once I got at the position, I realized like how close this was to Carlsen actually doing something. He wasn't just sitting around, even though he was playing this in a very, very slow way. If Anand just sits around a little bit longer with like this move, and then this move, and then, you know, retreat to one of these squares. I don't know which one you really want. That was only one sitting around move, right? And then knight h5, I had to like move it again, and white plays f4. Now, I think this would be an example of what the Hammer was trying to say, is that suddenly white's threatening f5. So, okay, black doesn't have that many choices. They take. Now white's in position to trade these pieces. This bishop's bad. Black's got 2 isolated pawns on the king side, and white can use the f-file. Meanwhile, black has less space. He doesn't really, in general, want to trade here and, you know, let these pawns get more mobile. Also, that's his best piece, remember. He's not really doing anything, and white is actually doing stuff. That was only, you know, I only played one random move for black, which didn't look any more random than the preceding 10 moves from white or black, right? It's just like, oh, it's just one more tempo of random maneuvering, right? Why not? Just sitting around waiting to see what Magnus's plan is. No, my friend, the plan, you needed to see it like, you know, a couple moves ago, because now it's like right in your face. Magnus is only about 1.5, 2 moves away from doing what he wants to do to black. So, you know, something good to realize. And once I sort of pieced that together, I was like, oh wow, thanks for telling us that, Hammer. That was a nice little breadcrumb you left for the rest of the world. So yeah, so white is definitely getting at this. And once I realized that there was this like time element, I wondered if maybe this king h2, king g3, g4 kind of stuff was necessary from Carlsen. I mean, it does strengthen his position. When he plays f4, he's in better position than with his king on g1 and pawn on g2, right? This is stronger. There's less counterattacking, less to calculate. You know, the king defends f4 as well. It's like obvious I don't have to sack any pawns. And, you know, if my plan is to eventually queen one of these pawns, which I've made very clear is my end game for white here, then, you know, the further up the board my king comes along with the pawns, the better, right? That's how you march your candidates down the board. It's supported by as many of your pieces as possible. The king's a slow one, and it's nice to get him rolling along with the troops. That can be the difference between the pawns you advance being weak and the pawns you advance being strong, is how well do you bring your pieces up the board in sync with them. So you don't want to go too fast and you don't want to go too slow. In the game, it feels like Magnus actually went a little bit too slow, because in this position, Anand played the move b5. Now, I saw one commentator call this an unbelievable double exclam shocker, and another commentator say a typical move for black in this opening. So I don't know what the truth is myself, since I have only played through, you know, 200 games in the Berlin, and I haven't seen this. And the Grandmaster in question has probably played through 2000. So I don't know if this is shocking or obvious, but it's certainly a very interesting and critical move in terms of black trying to find some kind of counterplay or different course for the game, other than white just gradually going f4 in peace. It also highlights the fight for the light squares, right? Remember a5 trying to get into a4. We played a4 as white, sort of gripping the light squares, right? And c4, gripping the light squares. With the opponent having the only light squared bishop, white was really trying to just clamp down, and black just plays b5 right in the face of the main clamp. And it shows how you can kind of like deflect pieces, right? Like if this pawn goes this way, this knight's support is going to become flimsy, right? If this pawn comes this way, then a4 is also aimed at undermining this structure. So so we see nicely a very complex tactical move, but we see how it's this kind of like relation of light squares across the board, right? From b3 to e6, the fight for the power of the bishop. And then there was one other important thing it illustrated that I wanted to mention. What the heck was it? Well, I blanked, sorry. Anyway, fascinating move. So let's say white takes it. Black plays a4, threatening a takes b3. And then after, let's say, pawn takes, rook takes, you can see there's pressure against c4. It still seems like maybe white can manage it, right? Like rook c1 to defend it. And then black can pile on pressure with this excellent move, knight f4, putting pressure on d5, threatening knight d3, getting active, trying to break open this bishop's diagonal. And I'm not going to analyze this out at like any great length. That's not my like interest or purpose here. There's computer lines up on the internet about this already. But black gets sufficient, more than sufficient counterplay, I think, against white in this position. Because these pawns are just liable to collapse, and suddenly, you know, this piece is awkward, this bishop is strong, the king's a little bit exposed. I mean, everything suddenly becomes tactically weird for white. This is one thing I saw somebody mention. You know, not only is this pawn so dead that black doesn't have to hurry to take it, but this horrible piece that white's left with is discoordinated, and black's, you know, taking shots at other pawns and white's king position is bizarre. So just an all in all disaster for white, I think, if they take A takes B. Another option would be to play C takes B, since this piece is just barely defended. And I've forgotten what the plan for black was against this, but let me just make a first guess at it, right? And we'll just see if I get it right. I would think we maybe, even though I don't want to like trade stuff, this is the move that strikes at the light squares more. And now there's no pawn on c4. This knight has been destabilized, so I want to go after that, and I want to open my diagonal on b3, which could be weak, right? So my simple idea is that if he takes and I take, and now I'm attacking the knight 3 times, if there's no way to defend it and it has to move away, then I just play bishop b3 next move, and probably a good position for black, right? Like, let's see. Well, there is no piece that can defend this, and there's no counter tactic. There's no tricks. So yeah, so I mean, we're looking at something like, you know, knight retreats, black captures this pawn, this is hanging, this is still a bad piece, this is becoming a strong pass pawn, black's bishop pair is like out and starting to party, right? Knight f4. Suddenly everything's horrible for white. So our construction just seems to sort of collapse after b5, it seems, right? But now I'll say, when I first saw b5, I thought, oh, super clever, brilliant use of the light squares. But what if white just ignores you? Because the fact is, against these kind of like crippled pawn structures where there's doubled pawn, the main thing you want to do is actually not make any trades and let any of these pawns move, okay? The main thing you want to do is you want to be like, sure, you advance that. You can get more space with b4, right? How good would black's position be in the game? Magnus plays bishop c3, sorry. Don't want to add in another branch. Bishop c3. Okay, take more space, right? Now, have these pawns gotten better? Well, now 2 of them are undefended that used to be defended by a pawn on b6. So no good for black, right? Or let's say, okay, you could trade pawns, which is what he did. So let's just click on that. And then, okay, well now like, how good is your pawn majority, right? So this is in general how I've understood weak pawn majorities, is that for the most part, you don't want to like trade with them. You just like block them. You let them keep moving their pawns as long as they can till they just, everything is just blocked and stuck. And now your 2 pawns still seem to be securely holding back their 3 pawns. This is undefended and you're targeting it. Yeehaw for white, right? So so when I thought about it some more, I was like, yeah, b5, like, okay, it's so brilliant. But if white simply doesn't take it, does this actually achieve anything for black? Like, why is this good? What does this do for black? Okay. I mean, one of the main things it does is this horrible worst piece on the board now is targeting something, right? So at first blush, it's like, oh, actually b5 is like horrible. You know, we're like fighting where we're not strong enough and just giving white another target, giving a bad piece a job. This piece now looks great on the queen side, right? With pawns on light squares and a target isolated pawn. But the thing is, I mean, white was eventually going to play f4, and it turns out that black, by opening another area of the board, creates enough counterplay or distraction or confusion that white can't play their main plan. And that in itself is like a pretty good accomplishment. So now king c6 is played by black. You know, I wondered about white trying to play knight h5 and f4 anyway here. And then I realized that, you know, for example, black is now poised to just take on d5, right? Because that's what this knight was guarding. You know, and you can also throw in rook to b8 maybe with the idea of rook b3, but say you just take, right? Now black's got a passed pawn, and white didn't yet achieve anything special. So we can't just go ahead with f4. We have to deal with this, you know, changed situation. And the way Magnus tries to deal with it is he's going to bring in his king to solidify the center that he's been trying to clamp down on. Rook to b8. And I think this move is also a candidate, probably, this rook to b8, but I haven't analyzed it. I mean, it means you have to deal with this move, and then this. But the odds are decent that there's some way that this could maybe still be playable. For example, like rook here. Okay, this is off the top of my head because I didn't yet get around to looking at this, but I was thinking maybe here, just trying to come here, recover the pawn, just trade 2 isolated pawns and open more counterplay since they're bringing their king into risky position. And if bishop c7, then hopefully this does something. Check. If you don't take with the knight, I take here. Takes with the knight, sack the rook, take here, take here. Well, it's a mess, but it's quite likely playable for black, I would say. 2 pieces against the rook and nothing instantaneously getting destroyed. So I think this is like an alternative which could be considered for black. But anyway, the idea is goes to the open file. Magnus brings his king up. And now just bring the rook down here. So, this piece, the black rook is just more active since black gets to the b file first. And black got to the b file first. Let's see, why couldn't white go to the b file, I guess I should say. So he goes for the king f3 plan. Why not go for this? And I think the answer is that black can sort of evict these knights, like break white's control over these squares with just bishop g7. Is this right? Knight h5. My idea is just to take here, and then white's control over these 2 squares, and this diagonal will fall apart. So I'm forcing knight h5. Now I have to spend a tempo on this. So now I'm threatening to win this piece for sure. Rook d1 doesn't even protect it, and it loses e5. So, sorry, that's just a misclick. Rook d1 loses the e5 pawn as well as not defending d5 enough. So I guess I have to keep going with f4. And black probably just trades, because the idea is to bring the rook here and win the bishop. So that doesn't give white a lot of good options. And then the second idea is to trade on f4 with check and then take on e5. So, yeah. So that's the thing, I guess, is like white's tied to defending these knights. They're kind of like targets here occupying the center at this point. And that allows black to first get control of the b file. So once we go king f3, rook b8, so yeah, rook to b1 could be looked at here, and then bishop g7 would be the key move, trying to put pressure on these points again. But again, that might be one reason why I would consider rook a b8, because then you've got an extra attacker on d5. But let's say rook b1, bishop here. If knight h5, bishop here, again, there's pressure on these 2 points to an unpleasant degree, I think. Can white hold it together fast enough with this king, actually? Fascinating, right? I mean, I would think now black might play rook to e8. It's complicated. That's complicated. That's worth looking at again. Yeah. I'll have to look at that a little bit some more later, because that looks interesting, actually. So, okay, let's just see the king e4 from the game. The point is that the reason why this b file opening actually does something and is sort of like distracting white enough for this is now this rook is more active than white's rooks, because black got to this file first. And once you've got an active piece, then these kind of pawns just automatically become weak. And this is like an interesting facet of chess. But basically, when your pieces are really active, then almost any random thing becomes a weakness. Almost any random pawn of the opponent's, right? Like h3, c4, and a4 are all targets now that black's rook has gotten active. This is going to be an issue to defend if we ever want to move this piece. So, sometimes there are like a position with like a pawn structure and you look and you're like, here's one weakness and here's the other weakness. And, this is what I really want to attack. And you can sort of like label what weaknesses are. And then you look at some other position, you're like, oh, white has no weaknesses, right? And I could go back to this position right here before the black rook is active, right after this trade. And you could look at this and say, where are white's weaknesses? And you'd think about it for a while and you'd be like, well, maybe c4 is like slightly sensitive, but like basically white structure is healthy, right? But then once I get active, it's like, well, I could target that, or I could target this by trying to make this piece move, or, I could play knight f4 and try and go after c4, right? By distracting this knight, forcing it to trade off. Suddenly everything becomes like a potential weakness, basically, when your opponent's pieces are really active. And that's not like 100% law of chess, but it's a very, very typical factor that you'll find. And so that's kind of like the countervailing play or advantage that black gets out of this b5 move, is that while white is defending these two squares, black's able to get this rook active. And think basically that this position is comfortable for black with their activity, that they'll be able to go after these weaknesses enough. And supposedly that's what the computer engine said also. But right here, Anand played another fancy pants move, like his b5 move, rook to b4. And my guess on this move is that it's a little bit of like a getting excited kind of move. Like, I mean, if b5 is just a standard, boring, blah, whatever kind of move, then maybe this theory is completely wrong and Anand was just playing normal moves. But if Anand thought that b5 was a sweet move, like I think it is, and he was really happy with himself for finding it, he may have been starting to get into like a feeling or a mood of like, yeah, I can like do this, I'm going to like put more pressure on him, and I can play another fancy pants move and just destroy him, right? And this is a way of using a bad pawn structure and an outpost. This is, a very typical operation, sack and exchange to, get a strong passed pawn and activate your pieces, right? Like, after white takes here, you can play AB4 activating your rook, or you can play CB4 activating your bishop pair, right? Either way, it's like, oh, now you have this weak structure, I've got this strong passed pawn, and I'm activating my pieces. And that's like a really sweet thing. And rook b4 is the kind of move that masters will often play pretty flippantly in a middle game. Just like, yeah, it'll be tough for white to handle it. I'll have good practical play. Maybe I'll have the advantage even, I don't have to think about it too much. White's moves are going to be harder to play. And therefore, these moves are generally fairly successful. Against Carlsen, it's harder to be so flippant. And one of Anand's comments after the game was something to the effect that, he was sort of bluffing with rook b4. Like, it was sort of like a bad, risky bluff, right? Just like, I can do this. But I mean, white pretty much has to take it. I mean, he's not going to let you take on c4 with check and then take on a4 or whatever. I mean, he's not going to let you just put your rook on b4 and start taking his stuff. So white's going to have to accept the bluff with rook b4, and then, it turns out the black doesn't quite have enough compensation against, a world champion level opposition. So it's an interesting move, but it's actually the move which kind of lost the world championship match for Anand, kind of, because he was playing quite well, and if he plays rook b3, he's still doing quite fine. Yeah, so I think somehow Anand got a little bit less objective around this one move. Like either like overexcited or he was like nervous about how he was down a game and wanted and thought, oh, I should try and like win this game with black for sure. I shouldn't, I don't want it balanced. I want it like complicated, crazy. I need to like win right now. To me, in terms of confidence, the turning point in the match should have been the previous game 10, where Anand had white. At that point, I thought Carlsen was really the one who was like afraid that like Anand would win another game with white against him. Once Carlsen secured that draw and only had one more black to play and still up a game, I thought that Carlsen was like a heavy favorite to win the match. So Anand may be like reacting a little bit may start to be the one feeling under quite a lot of pressure down a game at this point in the match. Be that as it may, he went for rook b4. Carlsen took it. Now there's a question of whether to activate the rook or the bishop. In general, a rook is worth more than a bishop, so it's often more important to activate a rook. He activated the bishop, maybe because there are more opportunities to eventually activate the rook, and this is the only opportunity with the bishop. But let's say we try a takes b4 real quick, and then play rook to a1 for white, hanging on to this pawn, because that would be a really active rook if it took a4 and started to penetrate as well. So what are black's prospects here? White's plan is probably still f4, knight h5, f4 to make progress on the king side. If black plays b3 too quickly, it seems like white can handle it. Black doesn't have that many pieces that are actually active on the queen side. I don't see him targeting the a pawn with any other pieces, and I don't see him queening this pawn. So just strategically, I don't see how a takes b4 would be particularly better than c takes b4. Yeah, I'm just not sure what black does next with that position. cb4, knight h5. Magnus after the game said he was really happy with the way he resolved this position with knight h5 and quickly f4. Yeah, I mean, it seems like the right thing for white to do here is advance their plan. Like, you're still weaker on the queen side than black, even if black is sacked in exchange, right? I mean, bishop pairs are strong. There aren't any great files for the rooks at the moment. This is a strong pass pawn, and this pawn here is slightly vulnerable, right? If you're going to make progress here for white, I mean, you still have to activate your majority. That just makes sense. And so you have to keep playing aggressive moves. And I think a lot of weaker players think that technique is playing like simple, careful moves and being like very defensive and not giving your opponent counterplay, because we often hear like, don't allow counterplay, don't allow counterplay. But actually very often good technique is about being like aggressive and pressing your advantages before your opponent gets counterplay. There are plenty of positions where you can't stop your opponent from having counterplay forever, or plenty of positions where the only reason you have an advantage is because you're up a pawn, so you have to push that pawn and make a pass pawn. If you just sit there doing nothing, then your opponent sits there and they're solid, and eventually it's a draw. So you do have to press your advantages, or you don't actually have an advantage. And at the moment, one of white's advantages is being up in exchange, but another advantage is having a pawn majority on the king side. And if white only uses one of those two advantages and not both, then it's not clear that it's going to outweigh black's advantages of the protected pass pawn and the weak c pawn. So I think this was like definitely the thing he needed to do. The knight on f6 also not great, and this is a way to, make use of it. So king b7 is played, possibly freeing up this pawn, but definitely black's not stopping this f4 plan. And now white traded that bad knight on f6, like so. Hang on, why not king takes? Since knight f4 sacks this pawn. I mean, I know that it works out well, but I'm just wondering about the simpler approach. Knight f4 is like very good, and I know why it works. Just wondering for a second if this wouldn't be simpler. It doesn't give black the same degree of counterplay over here. But it also just doesn't like use white's advantages to break through as fast, right? It doesn't open the d-file for the rook. It doesn't go after these two pieces to try and break things open on the king side. So black still has their blockade, and knight f4 goes ahead and breaks their blockade. So probably there's nothing wrong with king f4. It's just you have to bring your king back and play knight f4 at some point to win the game. So let's just play knight f4 and win the game, even if we have to sack the c-pawn. Okay, now, any 1200 who's heard a grandmaster tell them not to allow counterplay, to them it looks like insanity, right? That Magnus is playing a move like knight f4. It's just like, how could you play this? This doesn't make any sense. What is this? But hey, that's the world champion. He's pressing his advantages. Rook comes into d7. So he's targeting these pawns, and his rook has finally penetrated. Black plays rook a6 here, allowing knight d5. Other moves that could be of interest, there could be this move here, trying to get the rook out of the 7th rank, right? Knight takes. Pawn takes. Now I want to just tie black up, so I guess I'll do it this way. It's a couple ways, but go here, here, and then probably, now that black's fairly tied up, probably h4 and g5 is a good plan here. I mean, I like to win a pawn as much as the next person and target weak pawns, and like, why would I trade a pawn for your weak pawn? But his pieces are passive at the moment. b3 we can deal with. h4, g5 seems like a logical plan here. And then the other thing black could do would be to try and chase the rook out with his king. But it basically just won't work, because the rook will back up, and then after rook c1, he'll get rook d7 again. And if the bishop comes here, he'll just trade it and get rook d7. So, yeah, so there's no way to stop to deal with this rook successfully here after this sack of the c4 pawn. Anand played rook there, knight d5, attacking c7, and then grabbing the pawn in f7. So now he's got himself a strong pass pawn, right? Brilliantly executed. And, he's leaving his pieces on risky squares. He's having to calculate a bunch of variations. That's definitely part of what I think of as good technique at this point in my own learning of chess. Good technique definitely involves a willingness to calculate tricky variations. And, he does so again on the next move with rook c7 check. Trading off black's rook to simplify things a little bit and getting rid of one of their pawns. Now, the tactical point is that if king here, you can go rook here, and let's say black tries to queen a pawn while you're taking his pieces. Luckily, b5 is covered by your pawn, and white wins. Okay, so that's the reason why in the game he plays king c6, and you don't see Carlsen play rook c1, right? Which you might wonder, isn't that the easiest way to deal with the knight? And at first I wondered this. I thought, attack their bishop, and then if their bishop moves this way, you play knight a6. Thank you. Right? And if their bishop moves this way, you play knight e6. Thank you again, right? Well, the reason he doesn't go for that is that this king move instead of king c7 was specifically to deal with rook c1, to avoid an instant loss to rook c1 because of b3. And then if rook takes, pawn takes, and your king is keeping the rook from dealing with the pawn. So on b3, you can't capture it, and then rook c1 proves not to be that helpful of a move here, I think. Sorry, Magnus just plays knight to b5, bringing the knight back into the game. I wonder if there are any other good moves. I mean, he definitely had to calculate carefully here. I haven't looked whether or not, e6 would also be good or some move like king f5. This pawn is definitely strong, and this bishop pair is strong, and his knight is cut off from his rook. So this is still like a tricky situation. But what he went for with knight b5 was he's threatening to just bring his knight to a great square in the center, and where it'll also be close to these pawns so it can deal with them. And once everybody's reunited, it's no good for black. So black has to try taking it here. This surprised me slightly. For a second, I was like, oh, shouldering, using the king. But yeah, that doesn't, I don't know. It doesn't help break the blockade of the e-pawn yet, and it doesn't stop these pawns from queening. Your king's actually running away from the queening square. So he just pushes e6 and then moves his king towards the queening square. So this is a position where now he's saying, oh, okay, I'm limiting the counterplay by bringing my king near the opponent's pawns. And this position was a set win for Magnus. He's just pushing this pawn up the board. If black takes it, he comes here, takes, rook takes, and his king is in time to stop these pawns, right? Threatening mate and winning the pawns. So the idea is he's just going to sort of march this pawn down. HG, HG, Anand played A3, and Magnus played king C3. And so now the threat is king takes on B3. And yeah, that would be the end of the game. If black takes here, for example, he can still push. Checking doesn't help. So takes, and if here. And he's got the pawns covered with his king. So on king c3, if this move, let's see, I was thinking here to just stop this pawn from ever moving again, but then there is bishop takes g5. So that variation we go here, here, take. The bishop would come here to stop it from queening. You can defend the pawn for a move, but once I cover this, I'm threatening e7, so has to come here. King b2. I think this white can eventually win. I was calculating in my head for a while. So that's one option for white here. But after b2, maybe another option would be g6 with another passed pawn to queen. So b1, you can take it. a2, you can take it. Bishop b4 check. Here. Here. And you again, queen with check. Bishop f6 check, king here. You cover that pawn. And then you push these home. So no need to win that rook and pawn versus bishop endgame. Against b2, this g6 would be the easiest win. Yeah. And by the way, at any point after king c3, the reason bishop b4 check and taking on e1 doesn't work is because of queening. So after king c3, this is the position where Anand resigned and Carlsen retained his world championship. So now let's just... since there are no specific questions, let's just discuss the match for a minute or two before we say goodbye to it. It was a very, very interesting game today. I think that Carlsen's play with king h2, g4, king g3 was somehow not the best plan. Largely because Carlsen himself said that, right? So something else should be suggested for white. I've suggested one plan that I came up with after just sort of staring at the position and moving pieces back and forth and staring at the position, trying to get at what it's about. Maybe a faster maneuver of the bad knight on f3, and then maybe looking to play f4 without all that preparation. And surprisingly, time does matter in the extremely slow-moving Berlin wall. Carlsen, I think, was getting around to that plan of knight h5 f4, and one move before he could execute it, Anand strikes with b5, blowing open the queen side with light square tactics and achieving sufficient activity for equality. And then it was his over-aggressive, ambitious rook to b4 move, which then cost him the game against Carlsen's very, very precise and well-calculated conversion. So what were sort of like some of the deciding things of this match? One thing is that Anand played the Berlin defense 4 times. And from the very first one, I said I thought it was the wrong opening for him to be playing against Carlsen. And I still think that. I know that he drew easily 2 games with the Berlin before this game that he lost, and he only lost this game because of his own pressing with rook to b4, right? He definitely got equality out of the opening and was playing a very, very good game. And it's not that Anand doesn't handle the Berlin well. It's just, it's a very comfortable opening for Magnus. And I'm not saying that this game is like the game that like cost Anand or that he lost this game because of the Berlin. He didn't. I mean, the Berlin went fine for him this game, but he definitely lost that first Berlin game, the D3 game, partly because Magnus is so good in the Berlin. And the only reason that, in my opinion, that he drew those 2 games so easily with the Berlin in between was because Magnus was ahead and didn't press too hard to try and win either of those games. I mean, honestly, like, he barely tried, in my opinion, in those 2 games. So I mean, those 2 draws because Magnus wasn't trying that hard to win. I don't think that was the place to fight Magnus. I think that the Sicilian was. Therefore, I think the critical thing in the entire match for Magnus was that one game he won against the Sicilian. That was the game of the match for Magnus because he convinced Anand to go back to playing the Berlin defense with that win somehow, which I think was drawing the wrong conclusions for Anand and his team. They should have just tried to find some other variation of the Sicilian, just hop around a little bit in the Sicilian. Anand has vast experience in the Sicilian, and Carlsen has not that much experience in the open Sicilians. I mean, he plays a lot of anti-Sicilians, and it's really not his like main thing to play a lot of open Sicilians. So I'm sure there were some variations available there where Anand could out-prepare him. And when Carlsen was having some trouble with his confidence during this match, I think playing a Sicilian where he's got a much bigger chance of losing as white and where he feels less comfortable, I think that gives Anand a real shot to like win a game with black at some point and really increases the pressure on Carlsen. So I think it was a mistake for Team Anand to move away from the Sicilian, but I also think that like the key game of the entire match was Carlsen winning one game against the Sicilian and thereby sort of scaring Team Anand back into the Berlin defense, which I think is like the match strategy mistake overall. Because overall, I think Anand played almost as well as Carlsen this match. I think he played at a very high level, and I think his white games were like extremely good. And he said that himself in the press conference that he was much happier with the games he played as white this match. And again, I think that's largely like an opening choice, right? Like last match, he played e4 against Magnus a bunch of times until the last game of the match, basically. And this match, he came out with d4 from the beginning, sharp, complicated, strategic games, putting maximum pressure on Magnus and getting an advantage with white in almost every single game. And that, you know, those games looked really good, and they put some fear into Magnus. And Anand won a game, which he didn't last year. So I think the games with white went really well for him, and that was partly good opening choice as well as opening preparation. And I think what really cost him was, one, Magnus's great game that he won against the Sicilian, and two, the choice to then revert to the Ruy Lopez Berlin. I think that was like a big mistake, and he should have stayed away from that because that's Magnus's territory. Magnus feels very comfortable there when he needs to make a draw, when he needs to press. Like he knows a lot about the Ruy Lopez and the Berlin in particular, which suits him decently well. And Magnus himself said he thinks that like all along he has had the feeling that the Berlin defense suits his style with white and with black. So to me, that was kind of like a decisive thing. I mean, would Anand have won the match if he'd played the Sicilian every game? I can't say that for sure. I mean, Magnus is a really strong opponent. But the match was close, and I think it would have been closer with Sicilians from Anand. So we would have definitely had a game 12, I think. And maybe a tied match. I don't know. I think it would have made some difference. So it was a very interesting and close match. A bunch of good games. Today's game was pretty interesting. I managed to finally really like learn something about the Berlin defense for maybe the first time in my life, thanks to this game. I think sometimes I'm not sufficiently motivated to learn intricacies from a drawn game. Although that's not quite true. Last year, they had a fantastic draw in the Berlin defense, and that was the other time in my life that I've learned something about the Berlin defense. So both times it was thanks to these guys. But all that said, yeah, it was really fun to learn about the Berlin. But the other great games from this match, I think, that are like really instructive are actually those other decisive games, and all the games where Anand had white were pretty much interesting. So Anand's win with white, you can definitely learn something from. I mean, it's obviously a big missed preparation from Magnus, but it's still a very instructive game to learn from for any of us who are not 2800 level. And Magnus's win in the Sicilian, beautiful. His win in the Rui Lopez earlier at the D3 anti-Berlin, beautiful. And then several of Anand's games with D4 pressing were really great, like game 10 just before this was very interesting in the Grunfeld, and the first Grunfeld game was interesting. There's a lot to learn there. If Anand trades on B6, that endgame is worthy of being played sometimes. So lots of interesting chess overall here. And, my thanks to Magnus and Anand for, putting so much effort into their games, playing their hearts out, and providing us with such interesting material. So, yeah, well done to them. I'm glad they got $1 million. And I hope you all have a great day as well. If you have any questions about this game or other games, feel free to leave them in the comments section. And if you have any further comments about what videos you'd like to see me posting to the channel, that's always welcome. Currently, I'm working on a couple series like my own games, which I've already started posting. So there should be more coming. All right.